Welcome back to Countryside Sagas, wishing you a peaceful day with open sky and steady ground beneath your feet. Now, let's walk together into today's countryside tale.
The spring sun had just cleared the barn roof when Bill Thornton pulled his 1949 Farmall M into the gravel lot of Henderson International Harvester. It was March of 1978, and the tractor, 29 years old by then, coughed out a plume of diesel smoke that hung in the cool morning air like a question mark. Inside the dealership's glass-fronted showroom, row after row of gleaming red machines sat under fluorescent lights. The new 86 series tractors, the 1086 with its turbocharged engine and cab so plush you could almost forget you were farming, everything chrome and clean and promising. Bill killed the engine. The Farmall M ticked and settled, its faded red paint dusted with the kind of grime that comes from actual work. He'd owned it since 1971, bought it used from a neighbor's estate sale for $800. 7 years of dawn-to-dusk labor, 7 years of never letting him down. Tom Henderson stepped out of the dealership's side door, wiping his hands on a shop rag even though they were already clean. He was third-generation IH, a man who'd grown up around these machines and believed, deeply, in the company's vision of progress. Bigger, stronger, newer. "Bill," Tom said, walking over. His eyes flicked to the Farmall M, then away. "What brings you out?" "Starter's acting up," Bill said. "Thought you might have the part." Tom nodded, but his attention had already drifted to the newer machines visible through the showroom glass. "I can order it. Take maybe a week." He paused, then added, almost casually, "You know, Bill, that Farmall M of yours, it's dead weight at this point." Bill's hand rested on the tractor's fender. The metal was warm from the engine heat. "Dead weight," Tom continued, warming to his pitch. "Parts are getting harder to find. No cab, no power steering. You're farming 320 acres with equipment from Truman's administration." He gestured toward the showroom. "I've got an 86 series in there that could cut your field time in half. Better fuel economy, too. Factory financing available." Bill didn't say anything for a long moment. He just looked at his tractor. At the steering wheel he'd gripped 10,000 times. At the seat he'd reupholstered himself with vinyl from the hardware store. At the engine that started every morning, winter or summer, if you knew how to coax it. "I'll wait for the starter part," Bill said quietly. Tom Henderson shrugged. It was a gesture that said he'd done his duty, made his pitch. What happened next wasn't his problem. "Your choice, Bill. But don't say I didn't warn you when that thing leaves you stranded halfway through harvest." Bill drove home on back roads, keeping his speed down, nursing the temperamental starter. The Farmall M rattled and wheezed, but it got him there. That conversation played out in 1,000 small towns across the Midwest in the late 1970s. The dealerships were pushing hard. International Harvester itself was pushing hard. The 86 series was their answer to John Deere's dominance, to the changing economics of American farming. Scale up or get out, that was the message. And for a lot of farmers, it made sense. The new tractors were genuinely better in measurable ways. More horsepower, better hydraulics, enclosed cabs that meant you weren't breathing dust and diesel fumes all day. If you were farming serious acreage, if you had the credit, if you believed the land would keep giving, the upgrade seemed inevitable. But Bill Thornton didn't upgrade. The starter part came in. He installed it himself in his barn, lying on his back on the oil-stained concrete, his hands black with grease. The Farmall M fired up on the first crank, settled into its familiar idle. Bill wiped his hands and got back to work. Spring became summer. The fields around his place turned green, then gold. The Farmall M pulled the plow, pulled the disc, pulled the planter. It didn't do it fast. It didn't do it in air-conditioned comfort, but it did it. Tom Henderson sold 6 new tractors that year. The dealership expanded, added a second service bay. International Harvester's stock looked solid. The future seemed bright and red. 79 came. Then 1980. The agricultural crisis didn't announce itself with sirens. It crept in like fog, silent, persistent, suffocating. Interest rates climbed. Grain prices fell. The farmers who'd leveraged everything to buy those gleaming new machines found themselves caught in a vice. Land values dropped. Credit dried up. The promise of endless growth hit a wall made of debt and depressed commodity markets. Tom Henderson started offering extended payment plans, then deferred payments, then he stopped taking on new inventory. By 1982, the lot at Henderson International Harvester looked different. The showroom still had tractors in it, but they sat gathering dust under those same fluorescent lights. Nobody was buying. Half the service bay sat empty because farmers were fixing things themselves, or not fixing them at all. Bill Thornton drove past the dealership one afternoon in the fall of that year. The Farmall M needed nothing except regular maintenance, oil changes, grease fittings, the kind of work he could do himself. He noticed the lot looked sparse, a few used machines sitting out back, but the rows of new inventory were gone, and in '83 brought more pain. International Harvester itself was hemorrhaging money, collapsing under the weight of bad decisions and worse timing. Dealerships across the country closed their doors. Tom Henderson held on longer than most, kept the lights on through sheer stubbornness and the last of his savings. But by 1985, it was over. Bill drove past in April of that year, and the lot was empty. Completely empty. Not a single tractor, just cracked asphalt and weeds growing up through the pavement. The showroom windows were soaped over. A for lease sign leaned against the building's front wall. He slowed down, almost stopped. The Farmall M idled roughly, the way it always did, its engine note as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. Dead weight. That's what Tom Henderson had called it. 7 years earlier, standing in that same parking lot, pitching progress and financing and the inevitability of obsolescence. Bill didn't feel triumphant. He wasn't that kind of man. He just felt tired and maybe a little sad for Tom, who'd believed so completely in a vision that turned out to be built on sand. The thing about the Farmall M was this. It was simple enough to fix. Parts were standardized, interchangeable across model years. The engine was straightforward. 4 cylinders, mechanical fuel injection, nothing electronic to fail. When something broke, you could see what broke. You could understand it. You could fix it. The newer machines, the ones Tom Henderson had been selling, they were marvels of engineering. But they were also complex, expensive to repair, dependent on dealers and specialized tools and computer diagnostics that hadn't fully arrived yet, but were coming. Bill's tractor didn't make him rich. It didn't cut his field time in half, but it also didn't bankrupt him. He farmed his 320 acres through the worst of the agricultural crisis with equipment that had already been old when he bought it. While neighbors lost land, while dealerships shuttered, while International Harvester itself crumbled and was eventually absorbed into what would become Case IH, Bill Thornton kept working. The Farmall M pulled the plow in 1986. It pulled the planter in 1987. Every spring, Bill would go through it, change the oil, check the points, replace any gaskets that looked questionable. Every fall, after harvest, he'd park it in the barn and drain the fluids, cover it with a tarp. By 1990, the tractor was 41 years old. Bill was 53. The agricultural economy had stabilized, though it never returned to the heights of the 1970s. The landscape had changed, fewer farmers working more land, consolidation, efficiency, scale. But the Farmall M still ran. There's a photograph from around this time taken by Bill's daughter when she came home for Thanksgiving. It shows Bill standing next to the tractor in the barn. He's not smiling exactly, but there's something in his expression. Satisfaction, maybe, or just acknowledgement. The tractor looks rough in the photo, paint faded to the color of dried blood. Dings and dents and rust spots, but the tires are good. The engine gleams where he's kept it clean. That empty lot where Henderson International Harvester used to be? By 1990, It was a Dollar General. The building got torn down. The new store sat at an angle on the property, facing the highway. If you didn't know what had been there before, you'd never guess. Bill drove past it every week on his way to the feed store. The Farmall M's engine note never changed, that same rough idle, that same diesel smoke on cold mornings. People sometimes asked him why he never upgraded, why he stuck with that old machine when newer equipment became available again, when the crisis passed and credit returned and farming stabilized into a new normal. He never had a good answer, or rather, he had an answer that didn't make much sense to people who wanted logic and efficiency and return on investment. It works, he'd say. And it did. The Farmall M wasn't dead weight. It was ballast. It was the thing that stayed steady when everything else was being redefined by forces too big for any one person to control. Tom Henderson never reopened a dealership. Bill heard through the local grapevine that Tom had moved to Des Moines, taken a job managing a parts warehouse for a farm equipment distributor. Nothing wrong with that work, honest work. But it wasn't the same as being third-generation IH, standing in your own showroom, believing in the future. The irony wasn't lost on Bill. The dealer who'd sold the future had been swallowed by it. The farmer who'd refused to buy it had simply endured. But that's not quite right either. Because Bill wasn't trying to prove a point. He wasn't making a statement about technology or progress or corporate agriculture. He was just a man who understood his tractor, who knew what he could afford to fix, who preferred the devil he knew to the devil he didn't. Sometimes the smartest decision you make is the one that doesn't feel smart at the time. It's the choice that looks stubborn or old-fashioned or unambitious. The choice to keep what works instead of chasing what's promised. By the time Bill Thornton finally retired in 1998, the Farmall M had been in his possession for 27 years. He'd bought it for $800. He'd probably spent another $3,000 on parts and maintenance over nearly 3 decades. The newer tractors Tom Henderson had been selling in 1978, they would have cost $15,000 or more, plus interest, plus the specialized maintenance he couldn't do himself. Bill sold his land to a neighbor who was consolidating acreage, but he kept the Farmall M. It sits in his barn still. His son-in-law starts it up every few months, lets it run until it's warm, checks the fluids. The engine still fires on the first crank if you do it right. The paint is oxidized past the point of restoration. The seat vinyl has cracked and been patched with duct tape, but the machine itself, the essential thing, still works. Dead weight. Those words echo differently now, 40-some years after Tom Henderson spoke them on that March morning in 1978. Dead weight implies burden, liability, something dragging you down. But the Farmall M never dragged Bill Thornton down. It carried him through. There's a difference. The empty lot where the dealership used to be is still a Dollar General. The store sells cheap household goods to people who remember when that same ground held rows of red tractors gleaming under fluorescent lights, when the future seemed like something you could finance over 5 years at 8% interest. Bill's tractor is older than most of the people shopping there now. It's outlasted the dealership that declared it obsolete. It's outlasted the corporate vision that built those dealerships. It's outlasted the agricultural economy that made both seem inevitable. What does that mean? Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. Depends on what you value. Depends on whether you believe progress is a line that only goes forward or a cycle that sometimes doubles back on itself. Tom Henderson wasn't wrong exactly. The new tractors were better machines, more efficient, more capable. In a different economic climate, buying one would have been the smart move. But wisdom isn't just about being right. It's about understanding context. It's about knowing what you can survive. Bill Thornton understood that. He didn't have the words for it probably, but he understood it in his bones, in his bank account, in the way he could look at his tractor and know exactly what it needed and whether he could provide it. The Farmall M sits in the barn now, silent except when someone fires it up for maintenance. Dust motes float in the shafts of light coming through the barn's gaps. The smell of old diesel and grease and hay hangs in the air. It's just a machine, metal and rubber and 4 cylinders of mechanical fuel injection. Nothing magical about it. But it's also more than that. It's proof that sometimes the oldest thing in the room is the only thing still standing. That sometimes refusing to move forward is the only way to avoid moving backward. That sometimes what looks like dead weight is actually what keeps you anchored when the storm hits. The dealer's lot is empty now, has been for decades, will be for decades more probably, or until someone decides Dollar General isn't profitable enough and tears it down for something else. But the Farmall M is still here, still ready, still capable of doing exactly what it was built to do, if someone needs it to. That's not dead weight. That's survival.